Well, let's get to our panel. Joining us from Moscow is Mikhail Fishman. He's the editor-in-chief of the Moscow Times. With us here in the studio is the Washington correspondent for ARD German Radio, Andreas Horchler. Raghida Dergham is a columnist and senior diplomatic correspondent for Hayat, a leading pan-Arab newspaper. She joins us from the United Nations in New York. And with us from Beijing is the anchor of CGTN's Global Insight, Tian Wei. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Tian Wei, let's start by talking about President Trump's relationship with China. Both President Trump and his administration have had some very harsh rhetoric when it comes to China, accusing China of currency manipulation, of not playing fair when it comes to trade, of not doing enough to rein in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and its missile and nuclear program. Yet these two countries have the biggest and most important trade relationship in the world. So what's the view of Donald Trump from China?
Well, this is an interesting question, and shall I say, the answer to that question is ever evolving. There is a difference, as you may know very well, that before the presidency, during the campaign season, and now being in the White House, you've heard so much rhetoric against China during the presidential campaign of Mr. Trump. However, once he comes into the office, things have been changing. He has been very careful, in fact, about the words that he would use toward China, whether it is on the One China issue or on trade and some of the other issues as well. One thing that needs to be noted, even just yesterday, at the closing time of the National People's Congress here in China, is the political season, as you may know, in Beijing. We have noticed that the trade representative nominated by Mr. Trump have been talking about the currency manipulator China was, but he said he was not clear about the latest situation. Certainly you see some very carefully chosen words from the Trump administration recently. But what I want to say is now people want to observe very closely here from Beijing about what Washington, not only what they say, but really what they do and the specific policies toward China. On the DPRK issue, if I could have 30 seconds, China has been proposed very clearly during the press conference given by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Double suspension, two sides, DPRK, North Korea, and the United States. North Korea suspend the nuclear weapon experiments and further tests, and the U.S. should suspend all the other events, including the joint exercise with South Korea, in order not to disturb further of the latest situation.
Okay, Andreas, let's turn to Donald Trump and Europe. The Guardian newspaper, the British newspaper, reported recently that most European media see Donald Trump as a, quote, buffoon and someone who will undermine transatlantic relations. In fact, the European Union President, Donald Tusk, called Donald Trump a threat. Wasn't very diplomatic, but that's what he called him. What do you make of those assessments?
Yeah, a lot of people have shared this view on Donald Trump, given what he said during the campaign. I think things have calmed down a little bit after he took office on January 20th, but still, there's a lot of doubt that the transatlantic partnerships, as they have been defined and have defined peace for 72 years in Europe, in Central Europe, are on a path of decline, given the nationalistic approach of Donald Trump that is pretty apparent. People are scared of what's going to happen with NATO. Some say it's a fair assessment to say everybody has to fulfill the 2% spending on defense, of course, but on the other hand, trade, Donald Trump said, TTIP is nothing I want to follow, and this is something that the German chancellor obviously is very keen to fulfill, and there's little chance that this is going to happen. So the assessment of Europe is still filled with doubt.
Okay, let's bring in Raghida Dergham. She's in New York. Raghida, you've had enormous experience covering foreign affairs and the United Nations. Now, we've just heard from the Trump administration that there are going to be deep cuts to the budget at the State Department, as well as the U.S. contribution to the United Nations. What are the impacts of those kinds of cuts?
They are very nervous here because the impact will be on peacekeeping operations. It would be on fundamental programs of the United Nations. I think also some people are worried that if the US goes on with these cuts, it's also losing influence because, as you know, in this organization in particular, so the host country is important, but also the level of contributions by the US have yielded for the US tremendous influence on this organization. So everyone is nervous here to see the impact, especially on peacekeeping, on operations related to refugees, all that sort of thing. But they're waiting to see what effect it will make in details rather than only in the generalities.
And Raghida, what do you think the impact's going to be on American foreign policy if there are deep cuts at the State Department? And that includes, of course, US aid to many countries around the world.
Yes, indeed. And many people here, or some people here at the UN are saying, well, you know, guess what? If you cut the contributions to the UN, let's say, for example, as an example only, if China comes in and fills that gap, guess who's going to yield more influence? It would be China who fills the gap, the financial gap created by the withdrawal of American funds. That is something that is talked about. That is not to mention how much there is of an impact on the bilateral level. But it seems to me that, for example, with Israel or Egypt, I don't know how much is it going to impact the relationship because, let's say, Donald Trump is really a God-given gift for the Egyptians for the new, after Hosni Mubarak was toppled down, and then, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, and now we have, of course, the new regime in Egypt. They feel very optimistic about Donald Trump. They feel that they have had a gift by getting rid of Barack Obama, whom they accuse of having embraced the Muslim Brotherhood.
I want to get to Mikhail in Moscow right now. Mikhail, if you look at the relationship between the United States and Russia, this is a relationship that's been discussed. In fact, it's been dominating the news here in the United States during the election campaign, even after Donald Trump was elected president. The relationship, particularly between President Trump and President Putin, has been one of the most widely scrutinized relationships here in the United States. Now, Donald Trump says he wants better relations with Russia, yet there are many here in the United States who think that that's not such a good idea, that the Russians are doing something underhand here to undermine the United States and the president himself. What is Russia expecting from a Trump administration?
Well, this is a very good question. I would say that if we take a look at it now, in practical terms, Russia has put its position on a hold. It's a hold mode because the American-Russian policy is being sort of reshaped at the moment, at least since Trump's aide Flynn's resignation earlier last month. So now the Kremlin just waits to understand what Russia's policy will be in Washington. But no matter what it will be, it's already clear for everyone in the Kremlin and in Russia that what has happened with Trump's victory and Trump's presidency is a huge victory for Russia and for Vladimir Putin. If you take a look at where Vladimir Putin and Russia have been a half a year ago and compare it for Russia's position now, you can clearly see that this position is very different. And you can probably hardly imagine any major global issue being now resolved without Russia's direct involvement. Would it be Middle East? Would it be now Africa, as it being reported not right now, or any other global issue? And this is what looks like Putin's victory. And what he also has achieved with Trump's win, with Trump's presidency, is this new display of respect from Washington, which Russians have been deeply looking for years already, for years, I would say. Right. And this is what they think they have now, and this is big.
Yeah, this has changed in a very short space of time. Tian Wei, I want to get to something that you talked about a moment ago, and that is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, their nuclear program, their missile program. And as you pointed out, that the Chinese foreign minister has put a proposal on the table, the double suspension proposal. That was initially turned down by the United States. And I want you to just hear what the New York Times said about the DPRK and its missile program ahead of a visit to the region by the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. The Times said, Tillerson will warn China's leaders that the United States is prepared to step up missile defense and pressure on China's financial institutions if they fail to use their influence to restrain North Korea. Those sound like fighting words. And how is Beijing going to respond to those kinds of threats?
Well, Anand, as you may know, I'm not coming from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. I don't know how the Foreign Ministry would respond, but well, listening to these words from New York Times quoting from the U.S. side, it seems interesting. There has been a mix of things. They are mixing politics, geopolitics, nuclear issues with financial and economic issues. And shall we say that is quite a dangerous path to walk on, because China has said in the case of the One China policy, for example, that is not going to be all bargaining chips on the table. That is going to be the principal issue. And there are principal issues that you cannot use it as bargaining chips. Having said that, though, China has always been this player in the region, trying to put all sides concerned back to the table, to the negotiation. The Chinese foreign minister, and as you pointed out earlier, said it very clearly about this double suspension plan. This is a clearly cut out plan. If both sides could follow that to a certain extent, or at least think about ways to reach there, it is already very helpful. You know, if there's a fight between two parties, others could only help to persuade the two parties to calm down. But if they don't want to calm down, there seems to be a problem between them. And what can the others do? Having said that, though, there has also been the comments coming from the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang at his annual press conference just concluded 1 day ago. He said this is a crisis at the neighborhood of China, and nobody wants a looming crisis in its neighborhood. Certainly, China is extremely concerned, trying to calm down the situation and trying to make sure to everybody there is a way to get there. That is the negotiation and dialogue. However, as you pointed out earlier in that quote, it is very dangerous to mix all of these issues of very different nature together. A solution is needed, not blurring the picture.
Right. Premier Li did say at his news conference that nobody wants to see chaos on their doorstep. We are going to have to take a break right now. More of our conversation when we return. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.